I'm Cheryl Kaw, LA County Library's Black Resource Center librarian, located at AC Bilbrew Library. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing you to tonight's speakers. Leading tonight's conversation is our library director, Sky Patrick. Sky Patrick was appointed LA County Library Director in 2016. In her role, she is responsible for the library's 86 libraries, 15 vehicle mobile fleet, and resources that are used by more than 3.4 million customers across LA County. Sky is committed to breaking down barriers and increasing access for all. In addition to helping LA County Library go fine-free and initiating several other services to help provide more access and opportunity for customers, Sky launched the library's iCount Equity Initiative, which ensures library services and programs address the needs of LA County's diverse communities. Under Sky's leadership, LA County Library received the 2023 National Medal for Museum and Library Service, the nation's highest honor given to museums and libraries. Sky continues to reinforce the library's role in the community as a civic and cultural center, a hub for public information, services, and discourse, and an institution of literacy, innovation, and learning. Tonight, Sky will be interviewing Fesia Davenport, Chief Executive Officer of Los Angeles County. Fesia Davenport was appointed Chief Executive Officer of Los Angeles County in January 2021. She is responsible for managing the strategic direction and day-to-day operation of the nation's largest county government, including the oversight of Los Angeles County's $46 billion plus budget and coordinating implementation of key priorities of the Board of Supervisors. In a county career spanning more than 2 decades, she has successfully facilitated cross-departmental, public, private, and intergovernmental collaborative efforts aimed at implementing a range of major initiatives involving data sharing to prevent homelessness and track outcomes for justice-involved individuals, probation reform, and providing legal defense services for undocumented residents at risk of imminent removal. She also played a leadership role in the launch of several new organizational units within the county, including the Office of Child Protection, the Center for Strategic Partnerships, the Office of Immigrant Affairs, the Chief Sustainability Office, and the Women and Girls Initiative. As Chief Executive Officer under the direction of the Board of Supervisors, she has led LA County's response to and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic across multiple departments, overseeing $1.22 billion in CARES Act funding and $1.9 billion in American Rescue Plan Act funding to bring urgently needed equity-focused assistance to residents, small businesses, and hard-hit communities. She is responsible for leading the county in carrying out a series of transformative board-directed initiatives, including the Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative and the Poverty Alleviation Initiative, both housed in the CEO's office. At the board's direction, she coordinated across multiple county departments in a successful landmark effort to return the valuable oceanfront property known as Bruce's Beach to the rightful descendants of the family that had been wrongfully stripped of their property 100 years ago. CEO Davenport has also been instrumental in establishing the board's Care First, Jails Last vision as a budgetary and operational policy, and in assisting with the launch of an unprecedented 4 new county departments in a single year. Welcome, CEO Davenport. Sky will hand the program over to you.
Thank you, Cheryl. You did a great job. I want to say thank you to Cheryl Call, our newest librarian for the Black Resource Center. That was a mouthful for your first entree, so great job.
Yes.
Welcome, Fesia. I will come right back to you right after I do the land acknowledgement. If I could have that pulled up, please. The County of Los Angeles recognizes that we occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tongva, Octavium, Serrano, Quiche, and Chumash people. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants, past, present, and emerging, as they continued their stewardship of these lands and waters. We acknowledge that settler colonization resulted in land seizure, disease, subjugation, slavery, relocation, broken promises, genocide, and multi-generational trauma. These acknowledgements demonstrate our responsibility and commitment to truth, healing, reconciliation, and alleviating this, I beg your pardon, and elevating the stories, culture, and communities of the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these ancestral lands. We are dedicated to growing and sustaining relationships with Native peoples and local tribal governments, including, in no particular order, the Fernandino Tactavian Band of Mission Indians, the Gabrielino Tongva Indians of California Tribal Council, the Gabrielino Tongva San Gabriel Band of Mission Indians, the Gabrielino Band of Mission Indians Quiche Nation, the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, and the San Fernando Band of Mission Indians. Madam CEO.
Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to Cheryl for that great introduction. I kind of forgot some of those things. So, when you've been in a place for a long time, it's always helpful to remind yourself from whence you have come. And thank you, Sky. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I wasn't sure at first if you had the right person, if you really wanted me as opposed to someone else, but I feel like I'm in the right place at the right time. So thank you.
Yes, we think you are in the right place at the right time. This is our Trailblazers series. So as the name implies, we try to bring on people that have done phenomenal work, that continues to do phenomenal work, and that's really figured out ways to lift boulders for the betterment of our communities. So you are in the right place. You were exactly the right person, and we're thrilled to have you here in the beginning of Women's History Month, obviously prior to African American History Month. This is the perfect place for you. So I have a ton of questions for you, Madam CEO.
Let's do it.
Yeah, and I think that there are going to be plenty of questions later on in the chat. Please feel free, those of you who are on and who have questions that I don't ask, to load them up in the chat. We will try and get to them. And Jessica is saying that, of course, the mics and video are disabled. So let's start with our first question. We're going to break these questions up. Let's start with some of the LA County questions. For those people who aren't familiar, and believe it or not, there are a ton of people really not familiar with what a CEO does, and more importantly, what the CEO of LA County does. And so can you just kind of orient and socialize our audience about what it is you do and what you're responsible for and how critical that role is?
Absolutely. A very, very common question. I get it all the time. The look of surprise, like, oh, I didn't know the county had a CEO. Sometimes I say, well, that's on purpose. I'm trying to stay under the radar screen and keep my head down and get the work done. But to answer your question specifically, and I think Cheryl gave us the entree. She said, the CEO is responsible for managing the strategic direction and day-to-day operations of the largest municipal government in the country. The question is, what does that actually mean? And what I often tell people on any given day, it could mean some different things. But let me talk about some fundamentals first. First of all, I think my bread and butter is managing a county's budget. And as you correctly indicated, it's about $46 billion. That is a large budget, and it's not something that you can just set and leave. It requires constant tending to and adjustments and modifications and calculations. My office is in budget probably about 9 months out of the year. That means that 9 of the 3 months, my staff is working on, preparing for, shutting down, transitioning into budget season. What that actually looks like is we work with departments. We will receive budget requests for departments. The department may want to implement a new initiative, the library lending program, which you successfully launched, or the Parks After Dark program, which Director Garcia, who's the director of our Parks and Recreation Department, has launched. So we take all of those budget requests in addition to directives that we receive from the Board of Supervisors in the form of motions. So the supervisors have a bold agenda. They are moving that agenda every Tuesday. And oftentimes that results in a directive to my office to go find funding, identify some funding for something. In addition to those two requests, we also have a number of things that we have to do. Those are, let's say, finding funding for COLAs, unfortunately for judgments and consent decrees and settlements.
Let me stop you there. Can you explain what a COLA is?
Sorry, yes. So that's a cost of living adjustment. And those are salary increases that the board provides to the county workforce, which is a great segue into the next point. So budget is the mainstay. We have in the county 64 bargaining tables, and we negotiate with all 64 every 3 years. And what we are negotiating for are for economics, which are basically pay increases. And then we call the other things non-economics. And so those are things that are related to conditions related to their employment or benefits. In addition to labor negotiations, the county has about 5,000 buildings, structures, concerns that we either own, lease, manage, or have an interest in. So we have the asset management branch that's also within the CEO's office. Their job is to make sure that those buildings are deployed to their highest and best use. And if we are not going to use an asset, to figure out ways that we could work to otherwise, I will say, dispose of the property. And that could be providing it to a community-based organization, providing it to for limited uses to advance community initiatives. So we have budget, we have labor, we have our asset management. We also have in my office what I call the policy initiatives, many of which you mentioned or Cheryl mentioned in the introduction. We have the Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative. We have the Homeless Initiative. We have the Poverty Alleviation Initiative. Those are things that are less administrative and they are more on the policy side of the house. So those are sort of the bread and butter foundational functions. What does that actually look like on any given day? Every day it's different. Sometimes people ask me what I do and I tell them it feels like disaster management. And I say that jokingly because it depends on what's happening with the county. We were preparing for a hurricane at some point in 2023, and that involved trying to evacuate residents from Catalina Island. I have the Office of Emergency Management within the CEO's office, and those are the folks that spring into action where there's some, major issue or a disaster that's confronting residents of LA County. And so every day it's different. We might be responding to a tragic shooting and a tragic loss of death over in the Montebello area last year. The Office of Emergency Management was involved, but we also helped coordinate the countywide response. So we helped, make sure that the Department of Mental Health was there, the Department of Public Health was there. And so I'll leave it at that, but on any given day, it could encompass a lot of different things. Every day is dynamic.
That's right. And so obviously, this, we have an asset. The library has an asset out on Catalina Island. So I remember
Yes.
the evacuation. And while we are not considered first responders, I often call us the Swiss Army knife department of the county because we can help in so many different ways and different capacities. And I think we demonstrated that with you and your team over the pandemic. You talked a little bit about the initiatives, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but for our audience who are not indoctrinated, does the CEO office create initiatives, fund initiatives, or both?
That is a great question. So I'll say that it's a little bit of both. First of all, let me start by saying that I am appointed by our 5 all-women Board of Supervisors. So we have Supervisor Hilda Solis from the 1st District, Holly Mitchell from the 2nd District, Lindsay Horvath from the 3rd District, Janice Hahn from the 4th District, and Catherine Barker from the 5th District. In terms of our government setup, our 5 elected Board of Supervisors, they really are the legislative and policy arm of the county. They are the tip of the spear, pointing, pushing, establishing what our North Stars are for the County of Los Angeles. Some department and some department heads, we have to get together to figure out how do we make that dream and that vision come to life? How do we make it real for residents that rely on us, right? And so in the implementation, I think there is a little bit of policy in the implementation because sometimes you're making very important decisions. You're helping to design, develop, and implement a program. And if that design and development is not done very carefully, you may end up working at cross purposes with the board's vision. And so sometimes you're making calls that are implementation calls, but they actually affect the policy. So we are one of the implementers. We help facilitate coordination and collaboration with county departments so that everyone is so busy. We want to make sure that we are paying the appropriate amount of attention to what the board has requested that we do. And so oftentimes you'll see the CEO not directly involved in the delivery of the service, but we're coordinating the countywide response. And then to your last question, funding, yes. We are often called upon to fund initiatives from board offices, in addition to the ones that are established and requested by departments.
Yeah, and so you're saying that the board is at the tip of the spear, but it also sounds like I think of it the way I'm very visual. So I think of the community needs, the board of county supervisors, the CEO and departments, and we're trying to create this cyclical organizational process in some ways because the board is really, based on what I understand and interpret, trying to implement the programs and the services that obviously are needed by community members, but that are requested by community members. Do you think that's fair to say that?
Oh, absolutely. We are definitely, we often say, the phrase public servants, but we don't always really, embody what that actually means. And yes, we are here to serve and meet the needs of the citizens and the residents of LA County. They are at the tip, the very, very tip of that spear through the democratic process. They elect our board of supervisors members, right? Because we have a representative democracy. And then our board of supervisors appoints its department heads to run its departments to then try to not just maintain what we call the safety net, but also to push the boundaries on this a very bold vision that we have that has been established by our board.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll ask the question about participatory governance a little bit later. So 4 new departments. So let's talk about this. So before the 4 departments, newer departments, there were, what were there, 36, 37?
Yeah, 36.
36 departments. So let's have our audience understand the Herculean lift that you and your team had to do in order to create a new department. Like, just kind of talk about that, and then what those 4 departments are meant to do when we think about participatory governance.
Absolutely. Let me start off by saying, Sky, is a whole thing. It's a whole thing. I know you know that, but let me unpack that. So when you establish a new department, we are governed by a lot of different rules and regulations. Some of them are federal, some of them are state, some of them are local, which means that our board has adopted them. And what we're trying to do is figure out, what is the vision for the new department? What populations are they going to serve? What needs are they here to address? And why do we need to establish this department to do something differently, right? That is where we start. And that's often in the board motion. The board motion will tell you, this is what we hope to see in the future. And so for 2 of the departments, they were brand new departments. And we had to figure out, well, what is the population to be served? And what is that number? And what is that catchment area? And do we need to have one office building centrally located in the county? Or do we need a more distributed model, like libraries? Do we need offices located throughout the county? And then the question is, how much staff do you need, right? And what levels of staff do you need? Do you need professionals? Do you need line workers? Do you need the technocrats? And then once you establish what your line staff looks like, then it goes to, well, how much support staff do you need? How many secretaries and clerks, HR, contracts people? So you're trying to work out this analysis, and we know that it is directionally correct. I've heard someone say one time, all plans are wrong, but some of them are useful. And so we want to be directionally correct because we know that things change. The situation is dynamic. The plans that we started with a year ago probably are not as relevant as we would have hoped they would be today, right? And so we always leave our rooms for doing adjustments. Then you have to do the big thing, which is identify the funding. And so we have what's called our locally generated dollars, which are primarily like local property taxes and sales taxes. But sometimes there are other revenue streams available. And one of the strategic tools to budgeting is to figure out how to leverage all of those other funding sources first before we use our very, very precious and very limited locally generated funding. So we did that for 4 departments. Probably took us about 2 years to get through the planning process to the day that they were implemented. And the 4 departments are the Department of Youth Development, the Justice, Care, and Opportunities Department, the Department of Aging and Disabilities, and then the Department of Economic Opportunity. And I'll just give you a quick overview, if that's okay, of each of those departments.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you that.
So the Department of Youth Development actually is something I feel like has been a long time in the making. Many years ago, in another role within the CEO's office, I worked with a young man who actually is retiring this month, Vincent Holmes.
I think he already retired,
Yeah.
but yes.
Yes. So Vincent Holmes and I worked on a Department of Youth Development program. And so we figured out what it would look like, what services it might provide. We figured out a model to enter into contracts with local, like law enforcement agencies, and we paired them with a community-based organization. And the idea there was, do not come to the attention of law enforcement. And if you did come to the attention of law enforcement, do not get cited, do not get in the car, do not get taken to the jailhouse, right? And so we figured out some programming that we thought would meet that end. That was around 2016. And so we ended up transferring that program to the Office of Diversion and Reentry. And I did something then that I often criticize today. We funded at Sky with one-time funding. And it was one-time funding for 5 or 6.
So anybody who knows you, they know that that will not fly any longer.
Well, right. So I did not expect to be in this role on the other side of that, 6 years later. Then we have the Justice, Care, and Opportunities Department. So JCOD is a department that was really born out of the work of the Alternatives to Incarceration, the community-based model. And that work was spearheaded by Dr. Bob Ross and a number of community-based organizations and advocates. And in some ways, it was the same sort of thinking as DYD. And this one had a community-based anchoring, which is this. We know that you have to be relational to be transformational. Government is not good at being relational, right? But the community is, and the community is there, and the community is oftentimes the eyes and ears of what's actually happening, right? They know before we know. And so under the ATI model, the original office, Alternatives to Incarceration, was established in the CEO's office. And it was here for about, I would say, a year and a half before it launched into and became a part of the Justice, Care, and Opportunities Department. And when the name was being bandied about, Justice, Care, and Opportunities, we were like, well, will people know what that is, right? And it doesn't specifically call out what they do. It's not like libraries are parks. And I think the point there was we don't want to sound bureaucratic. We like to get out of the cutting edge of 1970, where you have to have this really, bureaucratic name, right? And so their mission is to divert folks away from our justice systems when folks are coming out of our jails, out of our locked facilities, to help them successfully reenter society, to provide programming, job placement, temporary housing, transportation, all of those things that you need to get a footing, right? We live in a very, very complex, fast-paced environment. And it's very easy for this population to be overlooked in favor of, let's say, populations that are more sympathetic, right? And so justice, that's not the only thing that they do, but that's some of their staples. Then we have Department of Aging and Disabilities. The thinking there was that, hey, look, we're all getting older, and we wanted to ensure that the county was well positioned.
And if I could say, I heard a stat this morning from the director of that department that there are more older adults at this point than younger people, or something like that. There's a stat, something like that.
Yeah.
That's baffling.
When we were working on this department, we were working on the planning and trying to figure out all the positions. Aging and the Department of Economic Opportunity was actually a split of a department that used to be called WEDAX, right? And Workforce Development and Community.
Thank you. I was going to say,
Yeah.
Okay.
So that department was split into these two departments. And yes, I think once you hear the stats, even as you see all of the institutional memory that is walking out of the door here in a county through retirements, it really hits you in the face that we probably are not as prepared as we need to be. We're not focused on it. And so that is the job of that department. There are a lot of services that we offer, and previously they were scattered, throughout various county departments. And the board's intent was to place some focus on this very important population. Let's focus and prepare now rather than get caught 5-10 years from now, realizing that we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the programming, we don't have services. And then finally, we have our Department of Economic Opportunity. And, I can't say enough about having worked in the county for over 2 decades and realizing that services are important. I mean, there are people, I said this earlier today, there are people out there, they don't know our names, they don't know that we exist, and they are counting on us to change their lives, to make it better, to make it less horrible. They're counting on us to do something. I don't think that we always appreciate that services alone is not the answer, that we need economic vitality and we need economic resilience. We need jobs, because we know that the through line for many of our services, child welfare, juvenile justice, our justice system, we know that the through line is poverty. And you have to ask yourself the question, like, are you here to manage problems or do you want to resolve them? And so we need to understand in the county that the services is the starting point, but not the end point. And that's why economic opportunity is so important, because at the end of the day, we don't want to help people and then just return them to concentrated disadvantage where they don't have access to education and jobs.
I might even push that statement a little bit further than people wanting jobs or needing jobs. They need careers. They need something that they can really take pride and ownership in and become a part of this wonderful community that we are attempting to build as we're flying. I was going to ask you a question about, what your thoughts were about government versus NGO or CBOs, but I think you kind of answered that with your must be relational to be transformational. I think I kind of understand where you stand with that. I'm going to do a quick pivot here and talk a little bit about one of the offices, the Anti-Racist Diversity and Inclusion Office. And I'm not going to talk about what their goal or what they strive for. That seems relatively obvious.
Yeah.
But what isn't maybe as obvious is this the the unprecedented focus of this board on such a feat. Not only that, we see in all areas of the country right now a pushback, all sectors on anything DEI, EDI, JEDI, whatever you want to call all of the inequity work. But this board and your office are still forging forward in a very murky landscape. Can you talk a little bit about that and how impactful it is to have a county such as ours continuing that work at this point in time?
Absolutely. So one of the things I'll start off with is when Dr. Scorza came on board, so the Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion Initiative is also within the CEO's office, hired Dr. Scorza probably 3 years ago. And one of the things that we talked about, we would talk a lot, when he first got here. And I was like, you know what, we have this very short window of opportunity to establish a foothold, because we know that Ibram Kendi tells us that there will be a reaction, right? And so we needed to, I see right in the back. So we needed to establish this foothold. And one of the other things that we talked about was doing things, implementing policies, and I want to be careful the way that I describe this, doing things that are the feel-good solutions, and they probably are a value add, but the benefit is limited and maybe even transitory, as opposed to doing things that are deep, broad, and systemic.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you to flesh that one out. That's
Yeah.
that's deep.
Well, one of the things that we could do is we could do a training for everyone once a year, and we could talk about DEI and how important it is. And we can have a requirement that all the county departments engage in that, and it's sort of a check off the box compliance. The question, though, is who's looking at the policies, the processes, the procedures, the budgets, and what are the things that we can do to institutionalize those learnings, the approaches, into our systems and into our budget? Because if we are not able to get there, projects oftentimes have a beginning date and an end date. They can be easily deprioritized in the budget.
Right.
But if you institutionalize the thinking, the beliefs, the practices in your policies and procedures, it's more difficult to undo that. So that if the board changes, or if I'm not here, or if Dr. Scores isn't here, the work is already embedded into the DNA of how we operate, rather than being something that we have to layer on as another layer of work to be done.
I think you're going to have a similar response when I ask you about the Office of Prevention Services. I think I can glean from what you're saying is that the goal again is to bake in prevention and I assume early intervention as a secondary component. You want to say something about that?
Yeah, what I would say is, we often say, if you think about what counties are funded to do, and this is why we call ourselves the safety net, right? If you think
right.
about what we are funded to do by the federal government and the state government, we are reactionary. At least that's what the funding is for by definition. If you think of our large departments, DCFS steps in after something has happened.
That's right.
Probation after, right? And so one of the things that the prevention initiative is also trying to do is to institutionalize a practice and a set of services and funding so that we are more upstream, that we are working more upstream. And what that means is we're going to have to be creative about some of the things that we do on the back end. What do we do with funding from probation, or what do we do with funding for DCFS? DCFS is going through this paradigm shift in how they're going to be funded, the Families First Act. The question on the table is, can we take some of that funding when it becomes available and move it to truly preventative services, primary prevention, rather than tertiary prevention?
Yeah, and so if anyone's really listening to you, we hear all of the ways that the county is trying to make deliberate interventions early on, provide training early on, provide bureaucratic speak, but wraparound
Yep,
services,
yep,
trying to catch all of these social ailments early so that we can fortify the individual in order to move to their greatest selves. And I also always say greatest and highest use. So it made me smile when you said that earlier. So the reason I'm kind of coupling it and cupping it that way is because I have to talk about this homelessness,
yep,
right? And so I wanted to kind of start with like the solution oriented conversation because this is homelessness. This is now downstream. And
yes,
I understand. And I think all of our listeners heard you say you're trying to catch that early on.
yeah,
So, what we don't talk about much is that 38,000 people are in interim housing
yep,
and have been served. What we don't talk enough about is that 23,000 plus have been placed in permanent housing, that there are a double of the number of mental health outreach teams. I can attest to that in this department because we have those partnerships and relationships, that 11,000 people were prevented from becoming homeless. What you do here is the seemingly unwieldy amount of people, like you solve some and more come.
yeah,
Let's talk about that. Let's
yeah.
talk about how do you stay motivated, how do you continue to help people when it just seems like it's like you're drinking from a trough, a water hose?
Yep, absolutely. I was going to say earlier, we often say in government, we can't do it alone. And then we go off and try to do it alone. Like we don't, we don't, we don't do what we actually say, right? We say the platitude, but we're not walking the walk, right? On many of our problems, I mean, you have to understand the, kind of the larger context. We operate within, a capitalist society built on the haves and the have-nots. And then we justify that through the lens of a meritocracy. We'll say, well, this neighborhood is more deserving and these people made bad choices, right? And then we wash our hands of all of the societal ills that sometimes we contribute to in our on a personal level, on a family level, on a community level. And so on the issue of homelessness, we in government are not going to solve homelessness alone. We know, however, that when there is the political will to do major investments, transform people's lives, not one at a time, but entire communities, we know that it can be done because we saw that done after World War II, right? We saw the federal government build housing for veterans who were coming back from the war. We
Is this
saw
the New Deal?
yes, like the loans, right? So we know what is possible. And then the county has to do our part. We have to continue to do a better job to house as many people as possible. If we stopped the inflow into homelessness, we could house or shelter all of the homeless folks in LA County in about 3 to 4 years.
Hence the prevention and early intervention.
Thank
I'm
you.
following you, Fesia.
Okay.
I'm right here with you.
Excellent.
And I hope everyone else is. And so I'm trying to make this as open and accessible as possible. Let me do another quick pivot here because
Can I
we
can I
want to.
just add one thing to
Yeah,
that?
sure.
And here is where we as individuals, I think this is where we come to play. And I'm going to tell a personal story. I have a large family, 6 brothers and 2 sisters. My family grew up in Compton in the middle of the 1980s during the crack epidemic. There was a battering ram. There was a song about it. It was a whole thing. I had a brother who became justice involved. He received services from every department in the county, probably except mental health, which is probably the one that
The one that he most likely needed.
yes. And he was homeless and he had a substance use problem. And we as a family cut him off, right? It wasn't safe and so one of the questions is people often become homeless because they have fallen out of community. They don't have that brother, the sister, the aunt, the uncle, that community around them to hold their arms up, right? When they're at their lowest point. And so my family did, I think, the best that we could. You know, we didn't have all the services. We weren't, we weren't aware, we weren't as involved.
Mhm.
But if that becomes the standard answer to family dysfunction, we will always have a certain amount of people falling into homelessness. If we have rents that cannot be maintained at a reasonable rental level, the housing market, we're always going to have folks falling into homelessness. And so what I feel like we often do is we accept without question the larger confines of our society. Well, we live in a capitalist society and it's $3,000 a month for a one bedroom. And then
I haven't
we
seen that in a long time, but yes, I hear you.
work in government to try to address this larger societal complex issue. But some of the drivers of the problem, they're beyond government services. It's community and
And
family.
no, so here's what's interesting. You must be reading my mind because I was going off script and I was about to say, what is your why? Right? Your personal why, but I think we heard part of it.
Yeah.
Because you can't do this work. You can't continue to do this work if you're not really clear about your why.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And so I was going to pivot, but then I'm gonna bring up a book because you bring up something really important, and it's a really incredible book called Chasing the Scream, which is talking and somebody put that in the chat because I can't remember who wrote it. But the author is talking about exactly what you're saying about addiction. This one is based in addiction, and that addiction really happens because people essentially, I'm totally subtexting here,
Right.
but essentially people are seeking community because they have fallen out of alignment with another community, a
Yeah.
sense of belonging.
Yeah.
And so it becomes less about the substance and more about the lifestyle and the
Yes.
pack and the
Yes.
community. So I just wanted to like call that book out because I think it's really a critical book to look at this complex issue in a different way.
Yeah.
I have about 20 more questions, but I am going to stop with my questions because I see this chat is blowing up.
Okay.
So let's see if we can get to some of these questions here. So now that Proposition 1 has passed, has the county factored in group housing for adults who need substance care management and have several county facilitators at the site? Let's start with that part of the question.
Thank you for that question, Stacy. The answer is not yet, or if those conversations are happening, let's say between DMH and SAPC, CEO has not been brought into the conversation yet. But once again, that proposition presents a huge opportunity for us. And I think the question for us is, we need to be brave and courageous enough to use it in ways that have a tangible value add. And then that probably means, saying not to the proposal that you requested, but that probably means we're not going to be able to do everything, right? And that's what we often do in the county. We try to do a million things and we don't do the million things well, right? But it's because I get it. We have like an overwhelming need. So we want to make sure, we should be sure that we don't dilute our strength and the power of this revenue source to move the needle in a meaningful way.
And just for clarification, that was from someone named Linda Marin.
Oh, Linda.
Or
Sorry,
Marine.
Linda.
That's okay. So here's another question. Being a person from Watson Compton, what advice would you give to a young person from similar surroundings? I love this question, who might aspire to be a CEO?
What? You know what I would say is you have to be thankful. You have to be humble. You have to be brave. I feel like the reason why I am here today is because I did the assignments that no one wanted to do because they were hard, they were high profile, they were risky career wise. And, here you had little Fesia raising her hand saying, yeah, I could do that. And then the other thing is, you can't pay too much attention to your haters. So as your grandmother always said, if you don't have any haters, you're not doing enough. So you got to lean
Or as the young people say, don't read the comments.
in.
I love that. I love that. And I often say something similar to people who come on and say, well, how do I promote? Like, do the thing that nobody wants to do.
Yeah.
And show them that it can be done, not perfectly, but it can be done. So I love hearing that echoed. Here's another one, Fesia. In the spirit of Women's History Month, have there been any LA County initiatives, directives, or programs recently that increase access points and coordinated responses for women in need of protection provided under the Violence Against Women's Act?
So let me start off by saying I am not familiar with all of the specifics of that act, but I could surmise, what might be in it. And this one isn't exclusive to women, but women were the majority of the folks that are in this program. We have launched a program, our guaranteed income program. I believe it is the largest or one of the largest in the country. It's $1,000 per month for 1,000 folks for 36 months. We are doing it not just because we think that we should be doing this. We want to use it as a test case because we want to change the way that we fund public assistance in this country, not just in the state, but in this country. And so we want to show the federal government when we did this program and we allowed these folks an opportunity to plan, these are the types of things that they did with the funds, right? There's some judgment in programs where you receive public assistance. And there's the micromanagement because we want to make sure that, folks don't receive a dime more than, what they might be entitled to. Well, the guaranteed income program is the exact opposite. And as I stated earlier, I don't know all the provisions of the statute that you mentioned, but I would be surprised if there are folks that are in our cohort and we actually have 4 guaranteed income programs, but this one in particular, I'd be surprised if there weren't folks who are victims of domestic violence who are not in this 3-year cohort.
Thank you. I have maybe 1 or 2 more questions, but I have to just echo this comment that Fesia rocks, and I quote, end quote. Here's another one. Heavy, and so I think the answer is yes, but if you could just elaborate briefly on this one. Have you ever collaborated with other cities in regards to homelessness? I live in Oakland, California, and we need help.
Well, bless your heart. We all need help and prayer. So the answer is yes. During the midst of COVID, one of the things that really surprised me is I thought that one of the times where you would have a heightened sense of responsibility for your fellow man or woman was for a homeless person during a worldwide pandemic, right? And so we were leasing these hotels and we were working with cities. And some cities we had great relationships with. They were open, they cleared the path for us to go ahead and move forward. And then we had some cities, that were not so helpful. We had a city whose city council was going to vote to turn the utilities off to the hotel before we moved folks into the hotel, and we had to go to court and get an injunction. And so what I would say is start where you are and, look for your early adopters, right? Because they in some ways become the wind, in your sails or the wind beneath your wings. And for every, 4 no's you get, the idea situation is that you'll get a yes, right? And so, you don't, my mother used to say, and one of my sisters just texted me this today, nothing beats a fail but a try.
That's right. That's right. I'm going to ask you one more question here. It says, hello, I've seen a lot of school districts struggling with their budget. Some have been reducing personnel and even some schools have been closed down. Has LA County been affected by budget cuts and by which departments? The answer is yes, we have been affected by budget cuts, but I think Fesia might have some better news, better way of
Yeah. So
talking about
this is
that.
what I would say. You know, we tend to budget very conservatively here in the county. Not going to get rich working here. I started at the outset saying that we negotiate with 64 tables every 3 years. And a lot of that negotiation is over salaries and employee benefits. And we want to pay our employees a fair salary. We want them to be able to raise and invest in their families. But I also tell people we are not negotiating against Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos over at, who owns Amazon, he's not up on the other side of the table. On the other side of the table of labor, it's communities. And the more money that sometimes, not always, but the more money that we put into salary and employee benefits, what essentially happens is we take more money off the table for services to those who rely on us. And so we do tend to budget very conservatively. We have not had to cut our budget, let's say, because we negotiated a COLA that we couldn't afford. We have not had to do that. We did have our revenue drop in a matter of like 3 months to the tune of almost $1 billion in 2021 and 21-22. And so, and that was because of COVID, everything was shut down. And so we had all of our departments take an 8% curtailment. And in that next year, we could not afford a COLA. It was an extensive negotiation for us to work with labor, which they did work with the county to roll over their contracts and not insist on a COLA. But we in my office work very hard, we do not want to tell the board to do things that we simply can't afford.
Fesia Davenport, what a pleasure. Let me just say for everyone listening, Fesia is wicked smart, but she's incredibly humble, as demonstrated tonight. And more importantly, in some respects, she's super funny. So maybe we'll have to bring her on again and like let her hair down a little bit. It's been such a pleasure to have you. I think that there are plenty of other questions, but we are at time. So please enjoy your weekend. Thank you for joining the LA County Library. Thank you for everyone else who has joined, and we'll see you soon.
It's been a pleasure.